your last April meeting, the April 17th meeting. The second part of today is a conversation to bring to the full board the presentation that the Finance Committee, which has been charged with studying configuration, bring that presentation to the full board. So that's what we're about to do tonight. I am going to facilitate the slides. There is an input opportunity built into this presentation specific to configuration. It's not yet the budget portion. We'll explain what it looks like at the end, but I just wanted to let folks know. So we can't really see you. We won't stop for questions during the presentation, and there's an input opportunity at the end. So this is what we're going to do today. And the first part, which is really about our core values and our strategic plan, I'm going to turn this over to Jeannie Phillips in a second when I frame kind of why we started here. But Jeannie is our consultant from the Great Schools Partnership who's been working with us for a little over a year now on this plan. So again, we knew when we started a conversation last year and actually continued a conversation that this district has had in the past, that the most important way to ground a discussion about how we should be configured is in a discussion about what we believe we want for students. And so that is a strategic planning process. So Jeannie, I will advance slides.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I want to first acknowledge the committee of folks who've worked really hard on this strategic plan. We had parents and community members as student administrators, educators from different buildings. And so we had a big group of folks who've worked really hard in many capacities to solicit community feedback and then to synthesize that into core beliefs, goals, and action steps. So you can see those folks there. If we move to the next slide, I'll just remind you, I think last spring we looked at this exact graphic and talked a little bit about the various phases of the work, starting with engaging that committee and talking about how we were going to engage the community so that we could draft a shared vision and core beliefs, then moving to goal setting, engaging the community again, and then from those goals, articulating action steps. So here we are in phase 4 of sharing the strategic plan. So the next slide, just as a reminder of the questions we asked at the beginning of this process, which were focused on what are the hopes and dreams our community has for our young people? What are the core values that should guide our work? What skills and qualities do they need? And how will they know that the district cares for and about them? And those questions just yielded so much rich data. We engaged the community. We went to each of the schools and engaged teachers in those conversations. We had a big community conversation at U32. And then we also put out a survey with these questions and used that data to formulate the core beliefs for the district. What we found in our work was that well-being was super important to your community, that transparent and responsible leadership rose to the top as something that really mattered. Community engagement and relationships, rigorous curriculum and instruction, and humanity, justice, and community and belonging. All of those things were really important across the community. And we spent a lot of time synthesizing all of that data into this document, and then again, sending it out for feedback. I think this might be the 6th iteration of this document. Actually, we revised and revised and revised. That led us to the next phase, well, really into phases 2 and 3, where we had focus groups with students, with community members, with educators, and also solicited feedback via thought exchange to figure out, okay, what about these core beliefs? What is exciting or important? What's missing? And then if we do these, what does that look like? What are we already doing towards these? What more do we need to do? And that yielded even more data. That data really led us into a deep synthesis process where we were able to figure out that there were 3 main goals with some action steps underneath. And so the first goal is really focused on, could we go to the next slide, Megan? Thank you. Building and nurturing a culture of well-being and inclusivity. And so I think Megan is going to share the action steps document if people want to read all of the action steps. Is that correct, Megan? In the chat. So these are going to be, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to paste several things. I actually should have said that before I let you jump in. I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to post the slides so that folks can follow around with the entire presentation. And then there's 2 documents that are the core beliefs and the goals by themselves. So I will do that. Thank you, Jeannie.
So this first goal includes action steps around social emotional learning, around how we build community in our schools and beyond our schools, how we focus on inclusion, and how we can even think about assessing student well-being so that we can improve it. As we formulated these goals, we also thought about how are we going to measure progress on these? And so on our next slide, we have some measures of progress. I'm asking Megan to do multiple things at one time. So there are some existing indicators, things that already exist in the system that will help us measure these things, the equity indicators that Washington. Go ahead.
Sorry. I can't actually paste things without stopping the presentation for a second. So I'm going to let you keep going. I'm going to forward it to someone else who's going to post. So for those on the screen, it is coming. It's just not there yet.
Thank you so much. So the equity indicators the district has developed, the communication and engagement plan, those are existing things we can use to measure our progress towards these action steps and this goal. And then there's also the creation of a new indicator, which is a professional learning plan that helps us keep track of the learning that we are articulated for this goal in the action steps. The second goal is really focused on what we're teaching in the classrooms. It's about making curriculum and instruction more responsive to students, providing more real-world authentic opportunities in school and beyond school, and further growing instructional practices in our classrooms. When we measure the progress on this, we're going to be looking at some existing structures like the Common Assessment System, the Education Quality Monitoring Plan. And then we're also talking about instituting new indicators, a Youth Advisory Council, the Professional Learning Plan I mentioned for Goal 1 will also help measure here, and other regular feedback mechanisms to make sure we're making progress as we move forward on this goal. Finally, the third goal is all about leadership, the governance structures, and about engaging the community and communicating with community transparently. The action steps in this goal are really focused on strengthening family, student, and community connections and building the systems, including accountability systems that help us monitor our progress in the strategic plan. I just want to send I forgot about the indicator. Sorry. The indicators here, there are already a lot of existing indicators related to governance. And so those will really help us monitor our progress on this, including ed quality standards, the communication and engagement plan, the configuration study we're going to lead into. Those are all ways we can measure our progress in this area. And I just want to give another big shout out and appreciation to all the committee members who served to make this work possible. It was such a joy working with them, even when the work was hard. They had such a can-do attitude and worked so hard to really listen well to your community and to synthesize that into these core beliefs and goals and action steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. I'm actually going to take a second to put those links in right now. So forgive me, I'm going to pause the sharing. And that's mostly because we're about to share a series of slides that has a lot in it. So let me do this. So this is the configuration slides. And
This is-
folks on the screen, you don't have to follow along. This is just in case you want to, and these will all be posted on the website afterwards. And if you want a standalone copy of the core beliefs, is this. I'm going to check this link to make sure. Yep, that is what I thought it was. And then a standalone copy of the action steps, which are all in the slides. So if you would rather just look at it in one place, you can do that. And I would just reiterate, thanks to Jeannie. One of the things that I would say is that this process has been about as iterative as you could possibly be. And for a facilitator, that's really challenging. It's really important because that's how we needed the process to be, but I appreciate Jeannie's ability to roll with how we did the work. Okay, so now I'm resharing. Okay, so the last piece, just to close out the strategic plan part, what we found, these three pillars, you've probably heard us talk about these before if you've been in any sort of board-related meeting, but this is how we define the work within the system. That's how we take the vision piece and bring it down a grain size. And we already had these three pillars, and there's an incredible amount of alignment with our action steps coming out of this process. And these, which is really exciting because that means that we are really working on the things our community wants us to do. So these will continue to be iterated to include the action steps coming out of the strategic plan. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. And for the next part of the presentation, I'm also going to have the support of two of our administrators. As you know, the Finance Committee is the group of the board that was charged with the sort of shepherding the configuration study. So doing the deep work and bringing it back to the full board. And we asked two administrators, an elementary and a high school principal. So Alicia Lyford from East Montpelier and Stephen Dellinger-Pate from the high school to help with this. So they have been part of the Finance Committee and they'll help with this presentation. And I'm going to start with an overview of how we got where we are. And I would also just remind us, this is not the first time this district has had this conversation. You've discussed this from as far back as 2014. But starting last year, the board made a really concrete decision to say, before we think about how our district should be configured, we need to know what it is we want for our students and where we're headed. Because that's really any configuration we create needs to get us to this. And so last year, by design, the board started with strategic planning. That is when we put a request for proposals out, contracted with great schools, and started the work that Jeannie just shared. So everything that we're doing in this part of the study is grounded in that work. Last August, the board saw a presentation about different ways to approach configuration. The links that are in these slides are also on our website, so you can get them in different ways. But the board learned about various ways other districts in Vermont have studied the issue of configuration. And in September, the board charged the Finance Committee to lead the study and make recommendations to the full board. That's a structure they use. They chose to use the Finance Committee, and they changed the representation of the Finance Committee to make sure that there is a board member from every town. In October, the Finance Committee saw a number of pieces of data, again linked in here. In November, the committee did some brainstorming about different configuration options and decided that the full board should engage in that brainstorming. So they did that in December. In February, the Finance Committee reviewed configuration simulations. This is mostly what you're going to see today. The committee did ask a few extra questions that we've updated in these presentations, but that's what you're going to see tonight, which brings us to April. That's where we are right now. And the board's original target for action is June, and action is whatever the board decides it to be. But the board did put a placeholder in June to be able to move forward. And move forward could mean a decision, it could mean further study, it could mean whatever the board decides it should be. So again, another way to just represent how the board approached the work is this is grounded in what we believe for our students. We need to think about how to organize ourselves to get there and study that deeply, and we need to engage the community. The committee and board, again, engaged in a number of activities to determine their priorities for configuration. This process really focused on making sure all of our students can access high quality and enriching in instruction. And they discussed a number of things and landed on this set of priorities. And these became the priorities that we looked at different simulations alongside. So the board wanted to prioritize a configuration that lets our class sizes meet education quality standards and are sufficient to provide rich instruction, meaning big enough to be able to give strong instructional opportunities to students. Our board wants schools that are big enough to maintain full-time nursing and counseling positions. Our board wants to maintain or expand enrichment opportunities that are consistent across the system. Some of our schools are not big enough to provide some of these opportunities. The board wanted to limit or eliminate shared positions across schools. It's really challenging to have small FTE or to be covering multiple schools. You will hear us talk about that in this budget presentation. And so as the board is exploring configurations, they want to limit that for our staff. The board also identified a pretty high priority and a lot of commonality in looking at a configuration that moved middle school together to be grades 6 through 8 and really create a middle level program for those grade levels. That was a pretty universal recommendation. And the board wanted administrators to model, simulate what it would look like to have fewer than 5 elementary schools. I also put this slide in here. It's one that the board will see again in the budget presentation. After the budget failed, we did put out a post-budget survey, and it asked in general for some information about why people voted the way they did and what information they'd like the board to know. And the way Thought Exchange works is it monitors things in 2 ways. The 2 highest number of comments, so about 22% of the comments, were in support of configuration and reconfiguration. A lot of those comments sort of had the tenor of, I know this is really hard, and I think it's time for us to look at that. And the second most common set of comments were, the costs of our education right now are really difficult for our communities. And those 2, so in addition to just counting separate comments, Thought Exchange asks people to rate comments. And the 2 comments, the 2 themes that received the most rating were around consolidation support and costs. And I put that in here because as the board does its work and thinks about how to engage in community, this is a metric that talks about the level of support for these conversations. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. I know this is a lot. Configuration simulation. So this is really the piece where we show you what the finance committee saw a little bit earlier. And just a couple of things to get us started. When the board asked administrators to simulate these models, they wanted us to look at these models without looking at schools. And this was an important part of the exercise because instead of just taking our current reality and moving it around, it allowed us to say, what would we build and how would we build it if we could start from scratch? And it really opened up the conversation for leadership. What would we design if we could really start over with what would be best for students? The other thing that's really important to know, and you'll hear us say this a few different times, our articles of agreement require the vote of towns before things can close. So a question that we hear often is, can we just do this faster? And the answer is no, this has to be a thoughtful process based on your articles of agreement. Also want to show this slide has been in multiple presentations, both budget presentations and otherwise, but this shows our enrollment. We know that we have declining enrollment and will continue to decline actually quite a bit past FY26. But we show this because the simulations we're modeling for you used FY26 enrollment, and that's because we can't make this change next year. At least these significant changes. So FY26 felt like the right numbers to model. This is a very busy slide. So if you are looking at it on your screen or you look later, you'll be able to dive into this, but this is just our enrollment by grade level. And I think that's relevant because it shows you the changes starting at the younger grades and when they start to move up. And then there's a similar chart here for 7 through 12. Enrollment. So I won't spend a lot of time on those slides because I think that you can peruse them on your own. And I'm going to start with one more slide and then I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. The other thing that administrators looked at for the board was what is the student capacity in our buildings? And this is done based on an Agency of Education analysis of square footage. There's a per student amount. This actually uses the most conservative calculation. But at Berlin, we have about a 336 student capacity, 252 in Calais, 189 in Doty, 413 in East Montpelier, 268 in Rumney, and 1319 at U32. And that's important for the board to know as they think about what capacity do we have in our physical spaces. And then that last line is how many students are currently in our schools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, who is going to talk about 6 through 8 configuration.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having us here for this presentation. What you see in this slide is just, as we heard earlier, moving the 6th grade to U32 was pretty much on everybody's brainstorm list as a strong possibility. And so we just wanted to make sure that we showed what would that look like. The opportunities are to be able to expand to a full middle school program, not just a 7-8 program, which will provide some additional opportunities for our 6th graders and will allow us to expand and diversify some of our offerings to our middle school as a whole. There's some advantages to having more middle schoolers and how you do your program. It also allows us to expand our after-school programs, and it really responds to some of the enrollment declines, as you'll see how we kind of configure in the next slide. And so what you see in this slide is that in the fiscal year 26, the middle school would be comprised of 261 students, and the high school 912 would be 481. And that would take us from where we are right now with about 708 students, and bringing in the entire 6th grade, our enrollment would only be 742 because of the declines in enrollment overall. And I really want to point out the 12th grade in fiscal year 26, there's 145 students. When that group graduates, the incoming class the following year, so that'd be fiscal year 27, will be somewhere around 90 students. So we will have almost 50 student drop in our overall enrollment in just that year. So we will be down closer to our enrollment where it is right now when we reach fiscal year 27. And so just being able to accommodate the students, you can see that that's not going to be a problem. And also, it allows us to stabilize some of our workforce as well, because right now we have 3 corps of teachers, and those 3 corps of teachers can continue to teach both 6th, 7th, and 8th grade when we have those kinds of numbers, when we drop below 100, essentially. And we do not see any future year in which we break 100 once we get to these fiscal years for our class sizes. And so in the next slide, this is a slide you'll see a couple of different times. In the way that we broke this down was we answered some of our questions, which is what are our optimal class sizes? Are for instruction, are we meeting those? The answer for the 6-8 middle school and the 9-12 high school is that we have optimal class sizes. It really does limit or eliminates partial FTEs, and this is part-time teachers, which we know are difficult to find and difficult to place in schools, so we can reduce that need. We can have expanded offerings, and the potential cost savings just for this piece alone is that we would not need 5 teachers across the district for the grade 6 level classes, because we would be able to consolidate those teachers with the middle school cores as they are. And so we could actually reduce the total number of teachers we need for 6th through 8th grade. As you see, you'll see some of these same things for implications for further study. Some of the special education questions, how do we distribute our needed teachers, what recommendations we'd make around that. Essential art services would be changed. And then there's just some basic licensure logistics that we have at U32, because most of our teachers are 712 licensed. And so if the 6th grade is there, we'll need to expand to make sure that our teachers have middle grade certification, which would be important for us to have another year. This is one of the other reasons why it's important that we plan a year out for this, so our teachers can gain that. It's not a difficult process, but it's something we just need to go through.
Thank you, Stephen. For the next section, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia Lyford.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to share with you 2 different models that we looked at for elementary schools. This first slide that you see right here is if we were to go from 5 elementary schools down to 3, pre-K through 5. You see the average at the top there being 202 students. This was just a simulation. If we took all of the elementary students and evenly distributed them across 3 buildings, this would kind of be the average class size. You'll see on the next slide in just a minute that we actually had to start talking about actual buildings, because our current facilities don't lend themselves, all of them, to this model. One of the things that's important to notice here is it does reduce those extremes by balancing out the numbers. It offers the opportunity for robust music offerings and other allied arts in all of the buildings, fewer part-time positions, and more equity in responsibilities in this model of 3 schools. So when we looked at the facilities specifically, I'm not going to talk about the school, but the facility building. We narrowed it down to the Berlin facility, the East Montpelier facility, and the Middlesex facility. And you can see here this chart that shows you how many classes of each and what the sizes would be of each grade level. And at the bottom in the blue, you can see the average class size across the grades K through 3 and then 4 and 5. Honestly, when we looked at this, we know that there might be some variability in where the students go to school if we were to redraw town lines, which is not a project that we engaged in at this time, but definitely something to think about. Again, similar to what Stephen showed you, this slide, looking at those questions, it does fall into EQS. And achieve our district minimum numbers for class size. It does not completely eliminate the part-time staff, because we still have some of the schools at about 150 students. It would allow for full-time nursing and counseling. It would allow for opportunities for expanded offerings. There are definitely cost savings, and you can see the numbers here for what that would look like to go down to 3 facilities. One big thing for further study definitely would be further looking into the transportation, the special education support, and what that looks like, and the allied arts.
And I'll just jump in briefly to give a little bit of an update on transportation. We have our former lead person from First Student who knows our district very well doing a transportation analysis. We weren't sure if it would be ready for today, and it is not. But she is basically looking at these simulations and imagining where you might draw the transportation lines, because we know that if we reconfigure, we need to make sure that students are on the bus for a reasonable amount of time. Remember, we already bring all students to U32, and we are able to do this largely well, but she's doing that analysis. So you're going to see transportation in several places. That's already been set in motion. And then the other thing I would just add in terms of the numbers, these are numbers that the Finance Committee didn't see and wanted. And these are conservative estimates, meaning it's likely that there would be additional reductions, but this would be the people cost from not operating buildings. That's that first number. The cost of no longer needing capital planning projects for 2 buildings. That's a pretty significant number. And then this just demonstrates classrooms that would be reduced. There would be potential for additional, because we would also be reapplying a metric for allied arts and other things. So just to kind of explain that, and then I won't do it on the next one because it looks very similar.
Okay, this model looks quite different. So it's actually going from 5 elementary schools down to 2, but starting at kindergarten through grade 5 and having one of our facilities be an early education center beginning at birth, going through pre-K. Board, if you remember back in December when you were at East Montpelier and were drafting ideas on the chart paper, one of the big things that came out was partnering with our community and expanding our childcare offerings. This scenario does that. So it would partner with community-based childcare programs, possibly also add childcare for staff, have full-time nursing and counseling, stability again for class size variation. Some of our larger schools, and you'll see numbers in the next slide, it could create a leadership structure for those schools. This one, as Megan was talking about earlier, would require the vote of communities, because there would be one of the towns not operating a school. This would require a partner for the childcare component of the center, right? We would continue to offer pre-K through Washington Central before the pre-K would be partnering with childcare. And then we really talked a lot about what facilities do we have and which ones lend themselves most to this model. And so, Megan, if you go to the next slide, the reason we chose Berlin as the facility for the Early Learning Center is that felt like the direction most of our towns may be headed in, with childcare needs going to work, right? Heading towards Montpelier, Barrie, Interstate, all of that, as opposed to heading away from in other towns. So if Berlin were the Early Learning Center, we looked at current numbers. So there would be about 6 to 8 classes of 12 students in our pre-K. If we looked at the East Montpelier facility, there would be roughly about 300 students in that facility, utilizing 14 of the 15 classrooms. And if we looked at Middlesex facility, the important thing, going back to the town lines, we'd have to get very creative, right? And that's where that transportation study would also need to come in, because we're looking at 5 towns going to 2 schools and what that busing and everything would look like. One thing I just want to point out in this slide that I didn't mention is that the access to special education for 3 and 4-year-olds would dramatically increase, because they would be all housed in one building, as opposed to, as we have it right now, housed in 5 different buildings. And that's something that the previous model that I showed you wouldn't have the same impact. And then finally, looking at this model, this one actually answers yes to all of the questions. It could limit or eliminate partial FTE, optimal class size, continue keeping full-time nursing counselor, opportunities for expansion, as Megan shared the cost savings, what that might look like. And again, the big study for this one is transportation.
Okay, thank you, Stephen and Alicia. So a couple more slides before we do some input, and also just kind of a reminder, again, the board asked us to simulate things to see what is viable. What does the board think is worth further study? So there are a number of things to still figure out with any of these. These are conceptual models that the board asked us for so that the board could decide what needs further study. So I just want to remind us that's the level we're talking about. It's why a lot of these are estimated numbers. We also took a look at a couple of different things to illustrate for the board, either models that don't meet our configuration criteria that the board gave and are really not feasible. But this first one we showed to the board mostly to show the board the magnitude of the size that we serve, because I think sometimes we forget this. There is not just in theory, but there could be one single elementary school that serves all of our students, because 482 is not an exceptionally large school. It's certainly larger than we have. It would have optimal class sizes. It would limit FTE. Obviously, it would have more than one full-time nurse and counselor, and lots of potential for offerings and significant cost savings. We do not think this is feasible. We don't think this is feasible. We don't think our communities want it. Things like transportation would be significant, and it would require facility expansion, even in our largest school. But we offered it to the finance committee just to illustrate what our size really is. The second is our current model. And I think this is really important for the board to see. We don't have optimal class sizes in all of our schools. We have a lot of partial FTE, as you know, and you also talk about tonight. If we maintain full-time nursing and counseling, it becomes cost prohibitive because of our size. And we don't just have, it's not just that we don't have an opportunity for expanded offerings. We don't have the basic offerings in our school. In our smallest schools, we don't have the choral and band programs that we have in our larger schools because we just don't have enough kids to offer them. And as you know, the costs associated with this model will continue to increase. I also just wanted to point out that one of the challenges with the model that we have is we this year made some decisions around class size because we were presented with very small class sizes. And so we have merged kindergarten and pre-K programs in 2 of our buildings. When we do that just year by year based on what's coming in, we're not doing it in a thoughtful way across the district, and we'll continue to have to make decisions like that. We also modeled reducing from 5 elementary schools to 4. As sort of a smaller scale change. It only impacts a single building. But as you can see, we are small enough that it actually doesn't achieve the board's priorities. Our class sizes would still be small. It would still require part-time staff. We would have the same problem with nursing and counseling and expanded offerings. And so, yes, there are some potential cost savings, but probably not worth the disruption. So the final slide here, which I won't spend a lot of time on, is just a summary of the 3 configurations that we showed the board. And there's not a lot of new information.